Hi everyone and welcome back. Recently, things like cooking oil prices have been making the headlines, and in the last month, the CPI inflation or Consumer Price Index inflation was reported at 6.3%. The RBI had actually set an inflation target of 4% plus minus 2% a couple of years ago, and it's significant that this threshold has now been breached. So, today we're going to talk about the two different kinds of inflation. We're also going to have a look at some of the possible reasons behind the inflation in India we're seeing right now. And finally, we're going to discuss whether we should be concerned by this and how things could look going forward. So, let's quickly go over the basics. I'm sure most of you know what inflation is. It's a sustained increase in the price levels of the goods and services that we consume. When we talk about goods and services in relation to inflation, you see CPI and WPI mentioned quite often. So the CPI stands for the Consumer Price Index and the WPI stands for the Wholesale Price Index. These indices are representative baskets made up of products that consumers usually purchase so that their price levels can be tracked. There are, however, two different kinds of inflation, demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. When it comes to demand pull inflation, you may even have heard this common expression before. It's when too much money chases too few goods. Basically, when demand increases, consumption increases, maybe things are going well, the supply can't adjust quickly enough, and as a result of this, the price levels start to rise. This also basically means that your money might now be worth a little less because you can buy less of the goods and services from the same amount of money. The other type of inflation is cost push inflation. This is when input costs like costs of raw materials or wages increase and push the cost of production of these goods and services up, which increases the price level. We're seeing some evidence of this as well. In last week's video, we spoke about how recent reports have shown that consumption in India has taken a hit. And this time, instead of seeing a sharp V-shaped bounce back in consumption, we might be seeing a slower U-shaped recovery instead. So now let's have a look at some of the possible reasons behind this inflation that we're seeing in India right now. One of the main reasons is that supply chains all over the world have been disrupted by the pandemic. For example, let's have a look at cooking oil. Most of what we use for cooking oil is actually based on palm oil. As it turns out, edible oils are actually one of India's largest imports. Restrictions the world over actually impacted the cultivation of these crops, and in countries like Malaysia, the restrictions caused a suboptimal crop of palm oil in the last year. This ended up restricting the supply of palm oil and actually disrupted a number of supply chains all across the world. Supply side shocks like this have caused disruptions in multiple industries and have contributed to a trend of generally very high commodity prices all across the world. Another contributing factor is oil prices, and here when I talk about oil, I mean crude oil. Crude oil supply has been restricted and its prices are increasing. Recently, the Oil Minister of India appealed to OPEC, which is a cartel of oil-producing nations, to increase their supply and said that the high oil prices were causing inflationary pressure in India. This crude oil is then refined into petrol and diesel, and I'm quite sure you know by now how the prices of those commodities have been. Now, before people jump at me talking about the other contributing factors to the high price of petrol and diesel in India, hold on, we're going to address that in a later part of the video. The increased price of petrol and diesel also impacts the logistics industry and increases the transport cost for all sorts of goods all across the country. So, should we be worried or concerned about this rising inflation? One important point to note here is that there always has to be a balance between growth and inflation. And currently the RBI seems to be concentrating more on reviving the growth trajectory of the Indian economy. When the RBI takes steps to give a boost to the economy, such as increasing the money supply or lowering interest rates, they are putting more cash into the system, and this is bound to have some sort of an inflationary effect. This is known as an expansionary monetary policy, and usually central banks have to balance this with inflation and many other concerns that they look at when creating their policy measures. Another complicating factor to this whole situation is that the government is currently running a large fiscal deficit. When the government spends more than the revenue it makes from tax collections, it runs a fiscal deficit. The fiscal deficit was already an issue before the pandemic and had reached about 4.6% of GDP in 2019. All the spending that the government had to do during the pandemic only made this problem much worse, And now in 2021, the fiscal deficit has reached around 9.3% of the GDP, which is a very significant number. So what does the government do in these situations? To increase their revenue, the government increases the tax on certain things or the import duties on certain products. These import duties and taxes may help the government balance the budget, but the cost is being passed on to the consumers, which in turn increases the inflation again. We can see this with petrol and diesel costs, which have crossed above 100 rupees a litre. This seems to imply that this inflationary regime could continue in the short term while the RBI works to get the Indian economy back on the recovery path. In the medium to the long term, as the economy recovers and as supply chains start to normalize all over again, we could see inflation start to reduce. Alright everyone, I hope that this video helped explain the current impact of inflation on the Indian economy and some of the reasons behind it. As always, if you enjoyed the content, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel, as it really does help me out a lot. I hope to see you guys again soon, and thank you.